Hi, my name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and this is the Forum. Thanks for joining us online. Artificial intelligence is embedded in our everyday lives. It influences which streets we walk down, what clothes we buy, what articles we read, who we date, and where we choose to live. It is ubiquitous, and yet it remains obscure for most of us. Amid increasing scrutiny of technology's role in everything from policing to politics, ethics has become an industry focus, but no one seems to agree on what these ethics are. How are the teams working on AI determining which ethics and principles to pursue? What sets humans apart from machines? Is the development of AI changing us? Can AI teach us anything about what it means to be human? My guest tonight is Linda Kinstler, a journalist and Ph.D. candidate in the Rhetoric Department at UC Berkeley. She has been reporting on the relationship between the digital and the divine for over a year and has had dozens of conversations with religious leaders, programmers, and believers of all faith about how our devices are indeterminately altering our interior lives. So tonight we'll be talking about ethics and technology, the question of what makes us human and what the future holds. Linda, thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's such a pleasure to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So you wrote an article called Silicon Valley, Can Silicon Valley Find God? And I wonder if you can just kind of give us a short summary of it. And I'm totally curious what you learned kind of from people's response to that article.
Yeah, it began, I guess, about a year and a half before the article ended up coming out. So in the months just preceding the coronavirus pandemic, I was reporting on the rise of ethics in technology, and that required me to speak to a number of people who had recently been hired to help tech companies come up with ethical codes and, enumerations of corporate values. And something that kept happening in my conversations was that the interviews would, seem to approach the question of religion without actually addressing it directly. And so they might say something like, we polled our employees and they said they all value fairness, justice, goodness, and morality. And of course, those are all great things. But the next question is, what do those mean? And what did those individual employees mean to say when they, checked those boxes? And so I began asking, to what extent do individual religious backgrounds come into these conversations about ethics, and how are corporations bringing in faith into these conversations? And some companies have been more kind of direct about that than others. And so those were the kinds of differences that I started looking into.
Oh, that's great. And what were some of the people's responses in terms of after you wrote the article? I mean, what did you learn just kind of from hearing from the general public or specialists maybe in the field after you'd written it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting. The response was robust. And one of the things that I discovered while writing the article was the fact that questions of faith, questions of, intelligence, certainly, what is intelligence? What defines human intelligence? What separates human ethics and morality from those of other living creatures? Those questions had always been front of mind, perhaps unsurprisingly, for AI engineers and researchers as they were trying to determine, okay, what is this thing that we're trying to create? And how will we know when we've created it? I think that's one of the big questions that kind of underlies all discussions of artificial intelligence, is that there's this, some would say naive utopian dream, others would say very realistic, ever approaching reality, that there will be something like artificial general intelligence. And so a lot of the earliest engineers who were working on this, in the 80s and 90s were thinking about questions of faith, and some of them were people of deep faith themselves. And so kind of looking at that history of the entanglement of religiosity and the creation of technology was really fascinating. And to answer your question, a lot of the responses pointed to that, and kind of suggested just how much this is still an open question. And, I think so many different parts of the technology industry as I'm sure many of the listeners well know, that are there very involved in different kinds of religious projects, whether or not they call them that or not. And so that's kind of the subtlety that I was interested in starting to tease out.
Yeah, it's interesting because different schools across the country that teach theology and philosophy of religion just have different foci and different emphases. But Pacific School of Religion, Graduate Theological Union have special programs for science and religion. So there's a lot of people who have PhDs in biology and chemistry and theology and philosophy of religions who talk about this a lot in your area. So, when you get a chance, you'll get a chance to go across the other side of campus.
Yeah, I would love that.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about like what people mean when they say artificial intelligence. Like when people ask you, what is artificial intelligence? How do you explain to them what it is that we're talking about?
Yeah, I generally tell them that it's already embedded in everyday technology, in your phone. Basically, one of the interesting things that I came across in this group that I wrote about called AI and Faith, they had this amazing project, was actually to begin to include religious communities in the conversation about what AI is. And to do that, of course, it required explaining that. And so I thought they had a really smart way of going about it, which is by saying, artificial intelligence, when we talk about AI or when we talk about machine learning or when we talk about algorithms, those are not really distinct entities. They're systems of deduction by probability. And if you just think about each of them as different kinds of machines that have huge amounts of data fed into them, and then through deduction come up with the most likely response, which is why, of course, we get these now infamous mistakes that kind of betray the immense bias that go into these data sets, and those are very well documented by people like Sophia Noble and others. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to bring out, was that it's not something that is mystical, really. It is spoken about very often as if it is, but in reality, it's, the product of human engineering, and therefore it will also carry along many of our own biases and predilections. And if we think about it more as a kind of compendium of knowledge rather than a new kind of intelligence, or certainly a deity, then it might clarify a lot of our language that we use when we talk about these things. So for instance, one of the engineers who worked on AI in the early days told me that one of the first things he did was he fed in the full text of the Bible when he was deciding, or coming up with one of the first natural language processing algorithms, which now is very important for AI. It's like in Google Translate, or even in search results when you're typing it in and it suggests autocomplete, that's AI at work. Or certainly when you're using Google Maps or shopping online and it suggests something else for you to buy. All of these things fall under the very broad category of what we would call AI.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of the challenges, that AI researchers are working on, just like some of the advances that you see happening very soon. It's really been, for 7 years, I've been seeing automated driving cars because I lived in Silicon Valley and saw a zillion of them here, then moved to San Francisco, and I see like 7 or 8 a day. And yet it's not rolled out for the whole, it's not everywhere yet. So maybe you can just talk about just kind of like where the state of the art is for artificial intelligence.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, because on the one hand, it seems already frighteningly advanced, right? The OpenAI Foundation released a new AI called GPT-3, which I'm sure many people have heard about last year, which seemed very robust and has an incredible ability to mimic and produce human sounding written words. So if you just kind of give it a prompt, it'll take it away. And many writers have commented on the limitations of that, and also the capacities when it comes to conveying emotion. And the Believer magazine just ran an incredible piece about a woman who used GPT-3 to tell a story about her sister who died several years ago. And it was this kind of experiment in what is conveyed when we use a machine to tell a human story, and what are the differences between human storytelling and machine storytelling. So I think that's certainly one of the open questions that will be, teased out forever. I think there's always going to be this question of, how far away are we from artificial general intelligence? Some people will tell you we're never going to get there. Someone in the piece told me that it was like saying that we're going to have artificial general intelligence is akin to the delusions of Nebuchadnezzar. It's just this, it's never going to happen. And yet it motivates so much research. And others would say, no, like, not only do we already have artificial general intelligence, but also like we're getting closer. And now a lot of the work is focused on, precisely these questions. What should it be? What morals should it follow? What values should be embedded in the system? And I think, it's not so much, these questions come up in a lot of the things that need to be programmed before any kind of product is released, like leaving alone the question of AGI. But, one of the great examples I came across, in which I think about all the time, was this engineer who was asked to determine what the privacy settings would be for one of the first web browsers, and how you would be tracked as you go to different websites. And his manager just said, just do the right thing. And of course, the question is, well, what is the right thing? And who am I, this one engineer, to determine that for, millions of people who will be using this product? And so if you just kind of scale up those questions by several orders of magnitude, that's kind of what's going on right now.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just some of the problems with current AI technology, just like racial profiling, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I was saying, that all of these systems carry over the kind of implicit and often unstated biases that many of us have. I mean, that is what we're seeing in a lot of these systems. And, I think one of the best documents of this is, again, Sophia Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, where she documents how machine learning algorithms were used to identify, if you search images of Black women, it would come up with images of gorillas on Google search. And of course, and then Facebook, we just found out they just replicated that same problem, despite knowing that this was an issue in Google search, despite saying that they were working so hard to eliminate bias from their platforms. So even like, it was just such an indictment, because it's, no matter how much light we shine on these issues, still it persists. And I think that was a really interesting moment. It just happened, I think, a month ago that we found that out. But yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting and what interests me about these things is that they're so focused on categorization, right? And so the way they operate is by putting boxes around, people, things, whatever it is. So we will each be categorized. Certainly, according to Facebook, if you look on our settings, you can see exactly how we've been categorized, how our identities are parceled out. And whenever you do that, you're kind of grafting on your own set of priors to how these systems work. And I don't know, I think Kate Crawford, in her book, Atlas of AI, reveals a lot of these fascinating issues, and specifically that, all of the emails of Enron employees, all of the internal kind of deliberations and machinations and lies in that company, that was all fed into one of the first and biggest kind of natural language processing databases. And so you can't claim that this text is just text, that it doesn't come with assumptions, that it doesn't convey certain worldviews. And I think and the same is true for images, so as much as there's a database for words, there's a corresponding database for images. And all of these have the same problems with it, right? What is going in? And especially, decades ago when they were being created, there was no pause. There was no attempt to say, hey, let's really think about what we're feeding into these systems. And of course, now we're trying to do that, but it's harder, much, much harder to go backward than it is to kind of make affirmative decisions before something is created.
Yeah, the foundation has definitely been set, and you can't start a new foundation very easily.
Exactly.
Hubert Dreyfus was a philosophy professor at Berkeley who's kind of an expert on Martin Heidegger. And he wrote some very famous books called What Computers Can't Do and What Computers Still Can't Do. I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about what computers can't do. Just as you've been interviewing people and hearing what they've had to say about all these questions.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I think that's a tough question. I think it's one of the things that's being negotiated right now. I mean, if we just think about it in terms of, what can a computer capture of the human experience, there's a reason why a lot of these conversations often verge into the realm of spirituality, because, it's kind of this romantic sensibility which Sherry Turkle documented in one of her early books, the second self, I think. You sit before a computer and it's like kind of this almost marvelous thing, and you don't really know what your personal interaction with this seemingly intelligent thing is, but you don't really know what it is. And Sherry Turkle writes about how that brings out this romantic sensibility in us, how being confronted with a computer, as I am doing right now, I'm speaking to you through my screen. It causes us to kind of be increasingly aware of what human sensibility is, right? What it is to have emotion. And then we question, oh, can these computers have emotions? Can they convey those things? So I think that's one of and I think in the piece I was trying to kind of gesture to that. And certainly I think COVID has been a really fascinating time for this. Because, and of course, again, like this forum is an example of this, so many religious communities have had to come together via Zoom online, and in some cases, doing so is in violation of their own religious practices. Like on Shabbat, you're not supposed to use any technology.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so what can
that self-contradiction that's right mixed right into it.
Absolutely. So
yeah, he's definitely an interesting figure. I'll have to check that Sherry Turkle book out, Second Self.
Yeah, I think so. Or I can get the citation for you later, but it is also in the piece.
Yeah, that's cool. Transhumanism. So the American Academy of Religion is the annual meeting for the academics who teach religion across the country. 10,000 people attend it every year. And there's a transhumanism and religion group there. And they talk about studying how technology is freeing human beings from biological limits. And I wonder if you just kind of came across anything about that as you were studying, just these issues of just,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge part of the conversation, and certainly the literature about the intersection of faith and technology. And, I think one of the phenomena that I find really fascinating is, okay, is transhumanism another kind of enchantment? Is it another kind, certainly it's a desire for something.
Yeah.
And I think in Silicon Valley, there are various groups that wouldn't call themselves religious, and certainly might even identify as, kind of resolutely secular.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about whether those might qualify as kind of, communities of belief, or certainly of spirituality. So I think this kind of question of transhumanism is, okay, what will humans be in 1,000 years? And will we evolve to kind of become robots? And certainly I think there's, good academic articles that suggest we already have, in various ways. And so I'm really interested in those debates, but I'm more interested in thinking about what those reflect about this kind of questioning and desire for belief, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. I mean, in a way, transhumanism already, I mean, so there's certain things we know we don't need to remember anymore, because we can just reach into our pocket and pull the cell phone out. And so in a way, we're I mean, anything that we interact with that much is going to change us and change the functioning of our brains too.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
gave a paper down at Singularity University a couple of years ago about just kind of like what's the theological perspective on some of these questions. And really, it was about two things. One is that in the world of philosophy and theology and humanities, like bodies are just getting more and more important. And part of it has to do with, women having a much larger voice in the field than 40 years ago. And it's so interesting that just as the humanities are just like recognizing the importance of bodies, that the technologists are almost kind of like dismissing the importance of bodies a little bit more through some of these dreams, like what you call enchantments, which I think is a great way of talking about it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they're dismissing it so much as kind of extending it, such that, whatever, if you were to have a chip implanted in your brain, like Elon Musk is working on, then, this would be they would say augmentation of the body rather than replacement of it. And I think the other part of this question about transhumanism is, okay, let's say that transhumanism is correct, that this is in fact what is going to happen, that this is the direction we're heading in. Okay, then what kinds of belief do we need to have for the transhumans, or for these entities that we will become and that we will create? And so Kevin Kelly, one of the founders of Wired, is working on a catechism for robots. And so, it's this interesting question of how do we integrate these technologies into our belief systems and what will be preserved.
Yeah, I think a lot about like Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher. So for him, I mean, he felt like philosophy would take a question like, is somebody telling me the truth? Like, and it's kind of an outlier in our experience. Like, there's not that many times in a day where you're like, is this person telling me the truth? And yet philosophy takes that question and just makes it like the sole way of orienting like how we answer questions in the world. And for him, just a lot of just like human culture happens, it's not in our brains. It's like we're enmeshed in this language, in these language games, in this culture. That's where intelligence is. So it's not like, it's not in our brains. It's kind of in what we share together in common. And it's definitely something I think a lot about after I read articles about transhumanism, about, AI and some of the just enchantments, the great dreams for the future, as I look through that.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, it is a useful lens through which to think about something like GPT-3. I think one of the marvels of these technologies is just when we look at the text they've created, how human-like it is and how it seems to be reflecting some kind of emotion or intelligence. And, if you think about language as kind of the field of play upon which we're all being created and which our kind of our commonality is shaped, then that kind of adds a whole new lens onto these conversations about what AI is.
Yeah, it's funny that Turing test, Alan Turing's idea of just, can a computer convince us that it's a human being? It's just, that was such an insightful thought that just still is just generating so much in terms of just how we understand what it is to be a human being and how we relate to the world. I mean, that's the other thing, is that we're such social beings. Like we're not human in ourself. We're kind of human is part of this history, part of that community of language. And so that's a huge part of all this for me too.
Yeah. And I think, back to one of your previous questions about what computers cannot do. I think there was a lot of discussion about whether the Turing test had been rendered obsolete after DeepMind's AlphaGo beat a human player in a game of Go. And so I think, but there, to that point, there are many things that a computer can't do. It cannot have, it can't operate as a human would. It can't really have a, there's a limit to these conversations. And one of the things I tried to get across in the piece is one of the big failures that computers can't do is have any kind of conversation about spirituality. It really can't go beneath absolute surface level. And interestingly, a lot of the systems that we use, like, Amazon's Alexa or whatever, when they were constructed, the engineers who built them decided to elide any questions of faith in them so that it wouldn't even be a field in which you could engage with these questions. And I think that's an interesting choice. And I totally understand why they would have made that choice, but it's an interesting one nevertheless.
It reminds me of like the early, like the World's Fairs. They'd have like the city of the future. It wouldn't have any churches or synagogues or temples or anything. And it just, there's so seldom do I see, and just kind of science fiction, even just like this, like what makes this future or technological world like untrue. It's like it's hard for us to conceive of a society that just doesn't have that somewhere, even though for 200 years people have been kind of predicting the end of religion. It's still so deeply ingrained in just how we experience joy and how we experience community, and just that sense of transcendence, that longing for a kind of connection to the whole thing that is hard to talk about in just ordinary days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the historian Jill Lepore has a really interesting hypothesis about this, which kind of animated a lot of my thinking about it. And one of the things she said she was curious about was that whether we have, somehow maximized all that can be categorized and rendered data, all of this precision, quantification, everything, that the only other place we have left to go is back towards enchantment, back towards kind of mystification, as a kind of, I don't want to say backlash, but response to the current moment. And I think I'm not sure if that's true or not, but I certainly think there are various ways in which that is being manifested. And one of them, as you said, is this kind of longing for some kind of spiritual, unity.
Yeah, it reminds me of there's an Annie Dillard article, essay she wrote about just how like we long to talk to somebody else in the universe. I mean, so in the 70s there was like all this hope that we could talk to dolphins, we could talk to the great gorillas, and this is like connected to that longing to speak to another kind of being. And part of the problem is that we have other kinds of beings that are totally available. Like we can talk to our dogs and our cats, and we could have wild animals that weren't that live flourishing lives. We could not be exploiting farm animals, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But it is this. It's like a part of human nature to kind of have a longing to communicate with something beyond us.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we have so many movies and sci-fi novels about communicating with our machines and having them become beloved to us. And yeah, I think all of it is kind of forming this literature. And maybe now that there seems to be some kind of critical mass of understanding and momentum behind questioning about AI and ethics, partly because it's part of this larger conversation about leaving AI aside, but technology, what does it do in our lives? How prevalent do we want it to be? How often do we want to be checking our phones every day? So I don't think these are totally separate conversations.
Yeah. So the Jill Lepore, is there a book that I can read that has that?
I actually don't know. She did have a book that just came out called If Then, which kind of is about these things, but I don't know that this hypothesis of hers is articulated in that. I think it was more
you get a chance, you think of it, email me because I would love to read that.
Yeah.
Linda, I've been thinking so much about this one issue, which I just encountered constantly. So I lived, basically could ride my bike to Google, Intel, Cisco, Facebook, saw all of them come into being. Like I lived in Mountain View before Google arrived in Mountain View. And so I've always had, tons of people I know, used to know. I go to the Google campus, I'd see like 7 different people I know, from soccer to church to, one of the things that really strikes me is about just Google engineers in particular, but Apple engineers, et cetera, is they've had an extraordinary education when it comes to like computer engineering, but they're like almost like little babies when it comes to like the humanities. Like they don't know who Cicero is, right? They don't know what the difference between Aristotle and Plato is. I mean, so I mean, you're like right in the middle of just having like an extraordinary education in the humanities. And I wonder just how that just, what your reflections are in terms of just the kind of education that technology people have is, and how that kind of biases what's possible in terms of just future technologies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, obviously that's not true of all of them, but I do think in general that is true. And it is, I think sometimes you see this kind of cherry picking from the humanities among technologists who see that they're coming under fire and need to find some kind of philosophy, again, because there is this longing, there is this kind of desire to be able to point to something larger than yourself that's not just what you've been taught in your engineering classes. And this is why we've seen the Stoics become, the favored philosophers of Silicon Valley. It's interesting to think about why those people were extracted from the Greek tradition in particular. And I think Apple is an interesting example because, of course, they have Apple University, where they kind of provide, their employees can take classes in political philosophy if they so desire, and I hope they do. I think it's shifting. I think that, at least in the very small sample set of people I have spoken to, out of this conversation about, a dearth of ethics, or kind of at least a problem of definitions, is like, okay, what do we say when a journalist asks us what our ethics are and how we found them? We need to be able to answer, and we need to say where we got them from. There is a movement towards incorporating more of the humanities into these companies, even if it is just in the form of here's the history of the last 10,000 years in 3 minutes. Like, at least they're doing something, I think. And I think, interestingly, because language is such a big part of AI, you're actually finding a lot of humanities PhDs go into that field because they are the ones with the expertise in how language systems work and how different languages interact with each other. So I think that will maybe, hopefully, have some effects.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to me. When push comes to the shove, so many times it'd be like, it's like this episode in Star Trek. Like that was the kind of what they could draw on. So they could draw on kind of popular culture things, but they didn't know what deontological ethics was. I think that's like, it would take me 5 minutes to teach somebody the basic of ethics, and like none of them know anything about it. It was funny. So it makes sense. Everything's just maturing and growing, and what a blessing that I was able to be around at the very beginning of so many things that.
Yeah, I think the question is, it's not that every engineer needs to know what deontological ethics is, certainly. It's just that if they are going to determine the parameters on which like all of these other fields will operate, because they are changing what it means to write literature, and what it means to practice philosophy, and how the humanities will be, integrated into our technology, then they should at least, have some passing acquaintance with it. And certainly some acknowledgement of how they are going to kind of fundamentally change the terrain upon which all of these fields are practiced.
Yeah. Do you think we're going to read like novels that are written by AI programs?
Oh, yeah.
And when will that be?
I think you could do it now if you wanted
3 years ago. The best novel of 2019 was,
Truly. I think it's a really good question. If someone put a mass market novel written by GPT-3 out, would anyone notice?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I have a friend of mine who she basically writes romance novels, and there are elements in it that are just, they're just cliches, of the genre. And
Yeah.
I could imagine, although, I mean, not, my friend is brilliant and she's wonderful. I'm not, disrespecting her work, but
I'm
I
sure.
could
Yeah.
imagine, in a particular genre, just being able to master that pretty well as
Yeah.
a machine.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what they do, is they do reproduce cliches, right? So that is kind of a telltale sign of something that's been written by a computer. But on the other hand, humans use cliches.
Yeah.
There's a reason why they persist.
Yeah, they're very helpful in sermons. I would love it if you'd, so let me tell you a quick story. So when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, I had to take only one more course in order to have a major in rhetoric. And the one course was, you basically went and read poetry out loud. I was like, well, how's that ever going to help me with my life? And so I didn't take the course and I didn't major in rhetoric. But I minored in rhetoric, and I keep laughing about that because that's the one thing I do all the time, is read printed material in public in front of large groups of people. It would have been a tremendously helpful class. But everything I took in college that I intended for my career turned out to be not helpful. Everything I took because I loved it ended up being super helpful. But maybe you could talk a little bit about just like the rhetoric department and like what drove you, what kind of inspired you to become part of the rhetoric department, and just how that part of your path has been unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's really funny to hear that story. I don't think it's offered anymore, that course, or at least not in that way. So yeah, I mean, I think it was Aristotle who said that to be a rhetorician is to speak well of all things. And that is part of why the sophists were so disdained. So because they could speak well of all things without necessarily knowing anything about them. But the rhetoric department at Berkeley kind of comes out of this tradition that began in the 70s of really concerted efforts to introduce interdisciplinarity into the social sciences and literatures. So the reason I joined was because it was the only place really, or one of very few places in academia, although the number is growing importantly, where you can really bring traditions together to speak to one another. And I think what we now would call science and technology studies came out of this movement. And what's happening right now is there are many people at Berkeley who are working on questions of secularism and post-secularism as within the framework of religious studies and literary studies. And so this is one of the few places where I feel you can do those things and be exposed to kinds of different kinds of literatures that wouldn't otherwise come into conversation, but also kind of on a fundamental level, recognizing how far we've come from the classical tradition, but also how not very far at all, and how the questions of what does it mean to produce testimony of an event? What does it mean to, move past the past? What kinds of justice have we conceived of, and which of those are inadequate? And what role does language play in kind of creating community? How can we play with language in all these different ways? So that's what the rhetoric department is about. It's about kind of interrogating language in all these different manners.
Yeah, I absolutely love the rhetoric department. I mean, like I'm the poster child for rhetoric. I'm a professional rhetorician. I mean, I grew
Yeah,
up and just
absolutely.
completely use what I learned every day.
Well, if you ever want to come back, let us know.
Oh yeah, I will. I always want to come back. So tell us some of the classes that are being offered in the rhetoric department these days, and some of the things that are just kind of exciting you about, what your colleagues are working on.
Yeah, well, so on that theme, I think a couple people in my department just edited a new volume of Kiparo, which is an academic journal published at Berkeley, which is it's called Networks of Belief. And it's specifically aimed at these questions of how is technology integrated into conversations of belief, religious or otherwise. And so I thought that was an incredible, I didn't know they were working on it until it was released. And when I saw it was out, I was my mind was kind of blown because it's, so many people are working on these issues, not always talking to each other, even though they're my colleagues and I see them every day. So yeah, I think that's going on. I would really recommend people take a look at that if they're interested in these questions. What other classes? I mean, I think, my favorite class that's offered every year is ancient rhetoric and ancient rhetorical strategies, just because for me it was such a revelatory thing to discover about kind of, we really focused on the Greeks as kind of what are the first theories of justice? How is probability kind of baked into what we know of truth? And those are kinds of, and what is an oracle? What do we do with these myths and where do they come from? It was really eye-opening to me. And also I had no background in it before. And so it just kind of shaped my whole trajectory, I would say.
Yeah, somewhere in this room I have the ancient rhetoric for the modern student or something. I got it like years and years after I'd been there, but yeah, I love that. I just even love that there are terms to describe different rhetorical strategies that are from our Greek roots. One of the things that we do, Linda, on our show is that we take questions from people who are in the audience. And so I encourage everybody who's watching to send in a question. And one question that came in is right here. What does the erasure or sidelining of the physical body mean for the ongoing cultivation of ethics as technologies develop and evolve?
Oh, interesting word choice, erasure. I think a lot about that question, about what erasure is, because I think in some ways, we have this idea that the cloud makes everything super secure and immutable, when actually there might be a good reason to suggest that it makes erasure easier and more prevalent than ever before. And I wonder if we're all becoming more comfortable with erasure, broadly construed. But the question was about ethics and the kind of departure from the body. I don't know. I think there are lots of ways to answer this question. I think it's basically, and the only real way of doing a good job of it is to kind of point out that it is an entire field of inquiry, and it is not one that I am an expert in by any means. And so I think right now all we have are questions, right? About what do we owe, or what kinds of morals dictate our relation with a robot, right? And even what we call, it's not even useful to think about a robot, although there is a really, really great conference called We Robot, which is about kind of legal and moral questions that are being presented as this reality nears in various ways. But anyway, robots have been really kind of mythologized, and it's not super useful always to use that as a word. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there are totally different questions. I think all of the questions we're asking about technology now, what role does it play in our lives? Like, is the phone a prosthetic limb already? Is it our bodies are already being shaped to conform to its desires and its operations? And so I don't know that those are totally distinct.
Yeah. So here's a question. How might our devices be transforming the way society thinks about the big questions of life and the kind of transitions too?
What do you mean transitions?
Like between life and death, between childhood and adulthood, between single and coupled, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
that's one amazing. I'll just like to give you a chance to think a little bit. But in 1994, when I would marry a couple, they'd be kind of embarrassed, like, oh, we met online. Actually, because the World Wide Web only just was invented, right? And now it's almost like I kind of take it for granted that the couples or have a very high likelihood of having met online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think I haven't really thought about transitions in kind of coupledom or not. I think it is obviously becoming very, very, very common, and as we just kind of live our lives online. But I think the more interesting transition is that between life and death, because our devices, back to this question of erasure, they're meant to preserve, or at least we think of them as that way. They are kind of substitute personas. And so some of the discussions about transhumanism are, can myself live on in my Facebook profile, or, in this kind of alternate version of myself? And there are some engineers and artists who've created, robots that replicate either themselves or their loved ones, and kind of studied what that means. So I don't know. I think this is kind of one of the most difficult and also most fascinating places to look, because it's fundamentally altering our understanding and certainly our experience of death. Whenever someone we love dies, their Facebook profile remains unless they've already told Facebook, please delete my page when I die. And that's a conversation they might previously have had with their, religious figure in their lives, So that's the kind of level I'm interested in, is like the platforms, these devices, they have really personal spiritual information. And in some ways they are kind of replacing the role, or playing the role, that a religious figure would have had for another person.
Yeah, it's so interesting, especially about those questions about just like, what is your online presence going to be now and in the future, and what kind of self are you trying to portray? I mean, it's certainly at the heart of all those conversations about Facebook and Instagram and the ethics of kind of how young women in particular are using those platforms.
Yeah.
I wonder if, just like as you read those articles now, like do you like, what is your take on that? Like, is Facebook and Instagram, et cetera, TikTok, like what are their dangers for young people, or what ways are they a gift to young people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the psychiatrist Jean Twenge, who wrote iGen, which just came out, I think, recently, has done a lot of research on this subject, and it's pretty damning across the board. That around 2012, when smartphones really became ubiquitous, basically all indicators of
Mental
happiness, satisfaction, curiosity kind of declined precipitously among young people. And it's hard to know what to make of that data, because it just seems so frightening. And especially as we think about technology and as something that broadens our horizons rather than closes them down, expands the kinds of knowledge that we have access to. But I think that there is increasing reasons to suggest that it's also narrowing the kinds of experiences that are available to us, like lived experiences, even if, that it's not the same to watch a video of a place as it is to go there. And I think that is the difference that's kind of might have been lost in this new generation that grew up with all these technologies. And I think one of the questions that came up in a recent discussion I was in about this was, okay, let's say we try to bring our young people off of technology. Let's say we, limit their use of smartphones, take them off social media. What do you fill it with? Because there is this void that's created. And I think that's one of the big questions. How do you create community when everyone is online? And when in fact to go offline is, now radical in some ways, and certainly isolating. And so parents are banding together. There are some really cool organizations. One of them is called Log Off, that is trying to encourage, started by a college student, I think, trying to encourage other college students to do the same. So, maybe we're in for a kind of reckoning, or like certainly I don't know, turn away from these things. I just saw a company was marketing a alarm clock that had no, and the whole point was that it had no Bluetooth, no internet, no connectivity whatsoever, because you're not supposed to have your phone in your room when you go to sleep. And in fact, I've tried to look for an alarm clock that has none of those things. It's really hard to find. They don't make them anymore. And so actually I was looking at this, it's kind of funny, but it's a good idea.
Right, exactly. It's so true. Here's a question. Do you see an intersection between the rules and policies of national security for a nation and the rules that make artificial intelligence? If yes, please describe the intersection.
I mean, yes, the answer is definitely yes. And I think that's what you will hear from many people who work in this sector. Okay, so a reasonable question when you talk to an engineer working on AI who might be worried about what they're creating, who might, are they in this new Manhattan project? Are they unleashing something that they will regret? Why don't you just stop, you might ask. And they'll say, well, if we don't do it, then China will do it or Russia will do it. And that is true, because right now you have all these firms and there are, some countries are more advanced than others, and people are at different stages, but it is true that there are now different AIs being created in different countries and operating by different laws. And it's why you saw, actually, I think it was last year that the White House released its first kind of policy agenda for AI, and the White House has a lot of people working on these questions. And so it's something that is very, very much part of foreign relations right now, or right now for the future, right? Like any military in the world is certainly working on these things and trying to integrate it into their defense systems. And that's why the question of ethics is so pressing. Not just for us in our daily lives, but also what is the relationship between these companies and the states in which they operate. And there have been some papers that have tried to enumerate all of the different rules by which different AIs operate in different countries. And obviously there has been little concordance. And so that's kind of one of the questions. Okay, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like there will be one AI and no others, but I think that insofar as many companies are operating under the assumption that there will be an artificial general intelligence, they want to be the first ones to reach it. And so you get people talking about an AI arms race and things like that.
Reminds me of that George Lakoff, Mark Johnson book, Metaphors We Live By. That just like that's human beings. Like I love the idea of an AI arms race, because that just shows why AI is so hard to do, because we all we have is these stories and metaphors and images, and so what is it beyond that makes us human, and how are the machines going to change our experience of that?
Yeah. Absolutely.
I'm going to ask you a question. You should just say pass, if because it's like the worst questions, like asking like a senior in college, like, what are you going to do next year? But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your dissertation, and if you just don't want to talk about it, we'll move on to another thing.
No, I'm happy to. My dissertation is actually going to be about oblivion, which is why I was really interested in the question of erasure that came out, because oblivion used to be one of the oldest ways of kind of bringing people together after a conflict. There was famously an oblivion after the Peloponnesian War in 403 BC, which brought the Athenians back together and reconstituted the city, and in fact, reconstituted the very idea of democracy. But I'm interested in that ways in which oblivion plays a role in the 20th century. And I think, there are a lot of religious kind of discussions of this concept of erasure and forgetting. But when it comes to technology, the place I'm going to be looking at is at the right to be forgotten, and how our machines, and how search engines, when they've been kind of bringing up all this old information, have also been posing new questions about forgiveness, and what needs to be preserved for all time and what needs to be erased.
Yeah, I love that.
So
That's
yeah.
so important. That's really cool. I'm glad I asked the question. Um, in Hawaii, they have something called ho'oponopono. It's almost like a way of being reconciled with other people. You may just want to check it out as part of your
Yeah,
thesis,
interesting.
because
Cool.
it's like another culture's approach to reconciliation.
Cool.
You covered so many different things as a journalist, British politics, the war in Ukraine. I wonder if you just, as you like look past all those different things that you've done, like, is there something that they have in common with each other? Is there kind of like a little through line through it that you think of as being kind of connecting all these different projects, or are they just totally what you just happen to get assigned to from your editor?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is that for sure. But I think in general, I'm just really curious about people, how people make sense of the world and how they articulate it, which I guess is what you need to be when you are a journalist. And what are the beliefs that make kind of the world spin, I guess, whether you are in Ukraine or if you are in London or in Silicon Valley, we all have these kinds of assumptions and um, systems of belief that kind of organize the way we see the world. And I guess that's one of the things, if I had to pick one, that would be the thread that holds things together. And also, how do we make sense of when the terrain shifts beneath us, and when it does seem like things are changing for better or for worse, but perhaps, immutably. So yeah, thank you.
This is more about like personal question about my life, but what do you think like these new technologies can mean in terms of just like for a regular church trying to care for people and nurture people in their spiritual life? I mean, we've learned so much through COVID, but I wonder if you have any thoughts or suggestions about just like how we might, as religious communities, make use of these
Yeah.
to kind of build people spiritually and help them when they're suffering. Because I mean, basically, from my perspective, the correlation between the health of young people and the introduction of the social media and cell phones, I mean, they're deeply correlated. So how do we create spiritual healing online as religious communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most direct answer is to say, use it, but also kind of know its limits. And I think it is this kind of amazing tool for various ways, and that it should not be done away with, and kind of has brought people together all around the world. But there is a limitation to it. And I think the question is, how do you engage in person while also having these tools? And why is it important to bring people together physically? And I think with this new generation, Gen Z or iGen, whatever, that will actually be the more pressing question, is not how do we use technology, but why should we gather together? So yeah, I'm really curious to see how different congregations kind of answer that moving forward.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I mean, it's in, like, we had a chapter and directors meeting earlier this week, and just, is San Francisco going to reconstitute itself?
Yeah.
Will those, the Salesforce Tower be, all the floors be occupied again? Will, will people be coming back to downtown San Francisco? And that's just one element of it, because, we have certain things that are just focused on people who come into work, but, we have other kinds of questions too. But you're right, is like, what is the future of being together?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder, just as I can't believe like we're completely out of time. It's just like the conversation just sped by for me, Linda. I really appreciate it. I wonder if you can just as we wrap up, just tell me some signs of hope that you're seeing just around, just from where you stand in your corner of the universe.
Um, it's a tough question. I don't
Yeah,
know. I
it
guess
is.
I'm hopeful that these questions are finding traction among people. That it was immensely heartening for me to see that people were interested in asking about the role that, spirituality, or just, what it means to be human. And that there is an increasing openness in the tech world to thinking about these things, and to bringing in people from the outside to think about them with. So that's something that gives me some hope, I guess.
Yeah, that's great. You're right. I mean, in a way, it's the answer to the earlier question, which is, you know, um, the engineers of the 1970s in Silicon Valley are very different than the engineers of the 21st century.
Absolutely.
And I think there's just more room for more different kinds of people. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's the story of Google for me. Is just like there just wasn't very. I mean, if you weren't like a crack engineer at the very early days, it's just almost like kind of harder to find your place. And now
Yeah.
maybe there are more places for people like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the interesting things that's happening in all of these companies and in kind of general American business is this question about how much should people's individual faith come into their work. And I think different companies are answering that in different ways, and it will be a really interesting kind of thing to watch as far as the kind of role of religion in public life is. So yeah, we'll see.
That's right. Well, please join me next week when my guest will be David Chavez, the Diocese of Arizona's Missioner for Border Ministries. We'll be talking about how to heal the divides our borders cause and how to rediscover what unites us. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give to gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278, 76278. And thanks again to Linda Kinstler. And thanks so much for joining me. What a blessing this conversation has been for me. I know that over the course of the week, I'm going to follow up on all those things that I wrote down, the different sources and citations you gave me to look at. And I'm really grateful that people like you are on the front lines and helping to figure out some of these really important questions in our society.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for the conversation.
Sure thing. Good night, everybody.